Hello folks, it's Who's of Doom, and welcome to this video. I wanted to discuss the parallels between campaigns in Warhammer Fantasy and 40k. In many respects, Games Workshop has been embarking on a short period of revisionist history, and there are interesting comparisons in how both of GW's core games are and were treated. Games Workshop has been pushing narrative within its core games for the past few years, and this has been largely what determines what is released. They have a grand strategy that is obviously planned out years in advance. The end times in Warhammer Fantasy Battle demonstrated that Games Workshop is willing to shake things up in terms of both gameplay and narrative. But interactions on Facebook and on Twitch comment streams on Warhammer TV have demonstrated that GW representatives are hesitant to brand the current Gathering Storm Hall of Cadia campaign in 40k as being the equivalent of the end times in fantasy. What I want to focus on is not just the differences between Warhammer Fantasy Battle End Times and the current 40k campaign, but on their parallels in lore and gaming history. I've witnessed GW representatives stating that the Gathering Storm campaign isn't the end times, this is kind of a quote, because there is no lore of the end times like Archaon was in Warhammer Fantasy Battle. What the representative is clearly alluding to is that the fate of 40k will not be that of Warhammer Fantasy. They clearly want to have a very strict divide about how we interpret each event in the game. But in general, the statement seems to be really semantics. They're just playing with the wording a bit. It is certainly true that Archaon was and is still called the Lord of the End Times. In AOS, he's actually the Grand Marshal of the Apocalypse now, whereas Abaddon in 40k is simply known as the Despoiler. They have different names, but they operate in the exact same way in both games. Let me explain. Both Archaon and Abaddon, or he's also pronounced as Abaddon, but I prefer it Abaddon, were once champions of humanity that were once good, but then they turned to chaos. Both are champions of all four chaos gods, as they are the leaders essentially of Chaos Undivided, right? Archaon was anointed by Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh, and Abaddon leads the Black Legion, which is composed of Space Marines representing all the different Chaos gods. Archaon looked for different armor, his mount, his sword, before he launched his attack upon the Empire. Abaddon, in contrast, launched 12 previous Black Crusades, each to obtain specific artifacts or achieve strategic goals, so that the 13th would be finally a success. 40k and fantasy have always had those common links right from the creation of Rogue Trader, when the fantasy world was literally transplanted into an environment in space and in a universe. All the factions of Warhammer 40k, with the exception of Tau, have their origin in Warhammer Fantasy. Even in terms of gaming history and releases, there are parallels between Warhammer Fantasy and the current 40k campaigns. For instance, in the last campaign that went through 2016, we saw the release at the end of a demon Primarch in the form of Magnus the Red. Now, I think you can draw clear parallels between that and the release of Nagash at the beginning of the fantasy end times. These are both huge, elaborate kits that bring back characters right from the very origin of each respected universe. There's certainly a lot of other possibilities for the return of more demon Primarchs, as many of them are in stasis or were pledged to return when they are most needed in order to, compete within the very last battle, which is clearly about to happen in some capacity. So I don't think Magnus will be the only Primarch we see. But here's another commonality that few people seem to really talk about, and that is GW engaging in revisionist history. However, I think this time will be quite different because GW has clearly demonstrated with the end times a willingness to change and bring about a completely fresh perspective. The last campaign in AOS really yielded definitive results, but the consequences of those results are still not really apparent. Most of the other campaigns that I remember have been fairly inconclusive. They're really statistical ties. Games Workshop has usually always pledged to make the results have an impact on the lore and on the future development of the universe. But I don't know if that's ever really been truly the case. I certainly can't point my finger on, where they made those connections. And in some cases, they've been forgotten altogether. So I remember two specific campaigns in the early 2000s. For 40K, there was Armageddon, and then traditional Warhammer, there's Albion in 2001. Armageddon, I really liked. That was the first campaign I ever participated in, and I thought it was really cool. But nothing was ever resolved. It was this bizarre statistical tie where, I think the Imperials won by like 1 or 2%. After we, added in everyone's results from personal games and so on and so forth. So I guess according to the lore, if you read up about current Armageddon, I believe the Steel Legion and Orcs are still actively engaged. That there was no real push of the narrative, maybe because it was a statistical tie, but it always seemed a little bit unfortunate. Albion was much the same. I don't remember much in the campaign, but I don't think it had any lasting impact either. There have been a number of campaigns in recent years, but I really want to focus on two of the other earlier campaigns. And that is for 40K, the Eye of Terror campaign in 2003, and for Warhammer Fantasy, the Storm of Chaos campaign in 2004. Both of these are vitally important. Not because they had a lasting impact, but because GW has returned and is basically, in the case of 40K, revisiting Eye of Terror. And the results of Storm of Chaos were really the end times that we just went through, a couple years ago for Warhammer Fantasy, which, as many of you know, had very significant consequences. So it's important to consider because at the time, both of these events were monumentous, huge campaigns, massive storylines, but they were essentially wiped from traditional Warhammer lore and history. Neither campaign, as I'll describe, was a success, and they built into the story basically nothing. They both resulted in absolutely no gain, no loss, and importantly, no change in story. It's like both campaigns essentially didn't exist. For instance, Voltan was introduced in Storm of Chaos. He was essentially thought to be the reborn incarnation of Higmar himself, right? A very important figure. And he fought toe-to-toe with Archaon. Basically, he was the hero of the campaign, although he actually didn't defeat Archaon. That was Grimgor Ironhide. But crucially, and don't tell anyone, but he was actually assassinated by Skaven in the aftermath of the campaign. He died. Yet years later, during the quote-unquote real end times that we just had a couple years back, he's alive and well. There's no explanation. There's no connection. And he dies a rather inglorious death. He had really a very insignificant role in the genuine end times. In the first, he was the big hero. this time around, he was a minor little guy that just kind of gets a very inglorious death. In Storm of Chaos, the end times were at hand. Archaon had marshaled the full armies of chaos, and he descended upon the Empire, but was defeated just in the final moments. And that is really not something that is talked about, especially in the official end times, where that was Archaon's initial massive push. He didn't go in once and fail. That was completely wiped out from Warhammer lore. It never happened. In Eye of Terror, something very similar is kind of going on, because Abaddon attacked Cadia, the very linchpin that holds Chaos at bay at the Eye of Terror, and Chaos actually won that campaign by the slightest of margin, but again, there were no genuine consequences. The end times in 2014, 2015 was, in fact, the reimagining of the Storm of Chaos. And in the same way, the Gathering Storm into this year is really the revisiting of the Eye of Terror campaign. Interestingly, I think one thing I find really fascinating about this connection is that they're really almost the exact same years apart, which is kind of I don't know if that's in any way planned, but it's an interesting fact. So I find the parallel between these to be really interesting. The Eye of Terror campaign was Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade, and that has caused some confusion because people rightly think that the current campaign must be Abaddon's 14th, but it's not. It's been talked about a lot. This is the 13th being revisited. The end times was well established in Warhammer Fantasy. There were plenty of other threats. The world could have been overrun by a Skaven or something like that, but everyone kind of knew that the world would eventually end the way it did if the story were to progress. 40k doesn't need to operate that way, but they certainly push, again, for chaos to be the big, most important enemy. I could certainly envision many other campaigns, and the previous 12 Black Crusades largely avoided Cadia, and yet the design team at GW has decided to revisit the scenario it had previously covered. In a similar way to Warhammer Fantasy, Chaos has always been the most feared enemy of the Imperium. So when you look at some of the key elements of the previous Eye of Terror campaign, they're going to sound very familiar. Well, first off, Acadia is attacked. That's fairly obvious. But the ancient pylons on Cadia, built by the Necrons, were an important component of Abaddon's strategy. There were rumors of demon Primarchs on Cadia, which this time it's not going to be rumors. And the Wolfen returned, right? Even some of the recent releases and the lead up to what's happening in 40k, it's all the exact same. It's just a complete rehash. I initially thought that GW would pursue a different storyline, but they haven't. And if you read the latest regimental standard, which they put out, every week or something, they place emphasis on the pylons and Necrons, on Cadia. So they are literally redoing the exact same narrative that they used to do, but the results are going to be dramatically different. It does appear that Cadia will fall, and that opens the door for many other possibilities. In the past, the fall of Cadia had no effect, but it will likely not be the result this time around. This leads me to my last comparison, and it's really more of a clarification about the fate of 40k. Games Workshop representatives are really eager to quell people's fears, and they've been saying things like, quote, "The universe you know and love will still be here after the campaign." They kind of acknowledge that the end times for fantasy was not necessarily perhaps the greatest strategy or the way to transition, even though I think they thought that needed to be done and that it was inevitable. I think only most provocative 40K players really think, and maybe people that just hold a grudge against GW for what happened to fantasy, really think that 40K would be a complete rewrite from the ground up. In my opinion, someone that went through the end times and everything else for fantasy, I don't think 40K will be in a completely different universe with completely different lore and with a completely different armies in the same way as AOS is currently, right? Where everything got redone. The entire concept, it's not the same universe whatsoever. The armies are all different. That's not what's going to happen to 40K whatsoever. There's no reason to ever do that. There were reasons to do that for fantasy. At the time, perhaps we were kind of blind to that. In hindsight, it makes perfect sense. I think it would be, certainly you could say, well, they did it to fantasy. But they have a completely different context. 40K is successful, whereas fantasy simply was not, even though people really loved it. In contrast, 40K has been ranked as the #1 war game. There's a little bit of dispute of this with X-Wing now, but it's still going very strong, and it's been a very strong game for decades. I don't see any reason to suggest it would not be a very successful game going forward. And the IP is very secure. The creation of the Moral Realms for AOS wasn't something unique or different. It was different in terms of fantasy, but they were essentially providing AOS what 40K had all along, and that is an infinite, ever-expansive narrative environment. 40K already has a million worlds within the Imperium of Man, each with its own history, people, context, environment, strange creatures. You could literally make anything you want up. And in contrast, the old world for fantasy was too constricted. It's based too much on standard normal geography. The world as it was basically an adaptation of our actual Earth. You had to be very creative to legitimately make reasons for why armies on different parts of the world are able to actually engage in battles with one another. Things are very static. They can't expand or contract too much. Empire cannot ever defeat chaos. It cannot take huge lands away from the orcs. Just not really much of an option. In contrast, the Mortal Realms and 40K are different. You can go anywhere in the Mortal Realms. You just hop through a portal, right? Same as 40K. You just hop on a starship and off you go. It's a blank slate. So what GW I think has demonstrated, however, in recent years is a willingness to kill off special characters and dramatically change the story in ways that they were completely unwilling to do in the past. They weren't willing to change things with Storm of Chaos and Eye of Terror. But clearly the end times demonstrate that when they revisited the Storm of Chaos, boy oh boy did they ever redesign things. And I think you're going to see a rebalance of the narrative in 40K in a massive way. 40K 8th will be the same universe. It will have the exact same factions, but the makeup and the balance of each could be dramatically different. There could be a lot of bizarre things going on. We just don't know. At this point, it's an unknown. We need to see how the campaign really plays out. But I think GW's willingness now to push narrative really provides a sense of history to the game and our own personal experiences. And I find that that's really interesting because, when you read a codex or the rule book, you're presented with a history of the past few thousand years, but the present has always been so static. It's never really pushed that much. So we always had a sense of history. We always knew, the history and the lore, but now we can actually experience it. Whereas me playing now and me playing X number of years in the future are playing in a completely different narrative environment. I think that's really exciting. And I think makes it much more real because we know and can experience the loss of a beloved character. Believe me, as I went through the end times, my heart was like just wrenched out of my body so many times when these characters that I loved and known for almost 2 decades were just getting slaughtered. So it has a very mixed thing. It's much like a popular a television today, something like a Game of Thrones, where like you really love the guy, but you know he could die any second. If you have that mentality in 40K, things seem much more real. The threats seem far more genuine. But there's also a chance for optimism because maybe the Imperium of Man could get better or expand or become more stabilized or something like that. In the same way, AOS is all about a conquest against chaos. They're finally going back, instead of constantly being scared, they're now out there with their armies and they're attacking and they're gaining ground against chaos. 40K could have a similar thing, even though right now the fall of Cadia could be kind of a disaster. And I'm building the Cadia army right now, so like I feel it. And I have no idea what the future will have for my poor little Cadian shock troops. So I think the parallel between Storm of Chaos and Eye of Terror being revisited, these two campaigns were like, 1 year apart. And now you have really the end times truly being a year apart as well. The fantasy end times, of course, ended a year and a half ago in July of 2015 with the launch of AOS. The 40K campaigns, though, that have led up to the Gathering Storm were really well underdeveloped and actually pretty much ongoing even then. Certainly at the beginning of 2016, that's when you could definitely say that these events are leading up to the current climax. This year is going to be a roller coaster, and we'll see what happens. Thanks for tuning in. And if you liked the video, please share it with those that you think might be interested. And consider watching more videos on the channel. Have a good one. Bye.